Welcome to this module, which is devoted to the Gospel of Matthew. We will dive into the Gospel of Matthew here, and I want to focus primarily on things that are unique to Matthew's Gospel in this module. Now, alert students will have noticed that in that opening image during the introduction, the camera ended up on a different Gospel symbol. It ended up on the symbol of the man. The man is the symbol for the Gospel of Matthew. And why is the man the symbol for the Gospel of Matthew? Well, open your Bibles, please, to Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. Look at how Matthew's Gospel begins. His Gospel begins with the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Now, as your eyes are cast down over these next several verses, and you see all those names, if it strikes a little bit of terror into your heart if you're a lector, think about the poor deacons of the church. This was always the litmus test for deacons in the seminary. If they could get through reading this from Matthew, then they could get through anything. So Matthew's gospel is the symbol of the man because his gospel begins, differently than Mark's, with the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Now, what I'd like for you to do is just pause me and read through this. Now, I cannot hear you. No one's going to know if you mispronounce a name, but I would like for you to read through this list of names and just say these words out loud. It can be a tomato kind of thing. Who cares if you get them wrong? I'd like for you to read through this list of the genealogy of Jesus, and then I'll be waiting here patiently for you after you come back. So please pause me now. And then after you read through this list, I'll be waiting here and you can come right back to the module. Okay, congratulations on getting through that list of names. It might have been a daunting task for you to get through it, but what I want to help you see now is this list of names has some of the best news in the entire gospel. This list of names, this is gospel here. Even this list of names, this is not just names out of some old Jewish phone book here. This is gospel here. There is great good news contained within this list of all of these archaic Jewish names. Some of the best news that there is can be found in this list of names, and I'm going to prove it to you now in this module. Look at how it starts. It starts with the rather obvious sounding statement, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's how it begins, the book of the genealogy of Jesus. Seems pretty straightforward and, again, rather obvious here. But that's because you're reading it in English. If you could see what it says in the biblical Greek, oh, the light bulbs will all start going off. How does it start in Greek? It starts like this. Biblos Geneseos. Biblos Geneseos, the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ. Now we translate the Greek word for Genesis as genealogy, but it's the book of the origins of Jesus Christ. Genealogy is not incorrect, but when you see that Matthew is using the same word in Greek for Genesis here, the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ, it's the same way as the book of Genesis starts off. Oh, now all kinds of connections can be seen. The book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ. Your mind immediately goes back to the book of Genesis, and what happens there? How does Genesis begin? Well, it begins with the creation of the earth. That's the purpose of the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. It shows us God's intention in creating the world. But here in Matthew's gospel, by using this term explicitly, the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ, Matthew is saying here the full purpose of God is revealed. Here we see the fulfillment of the purpose of God for creating the world. God created the world in Genesis for the purpose we see here in Matthew's gospel. God created the world in order to send us his Son, Jesus Christ. That is why God created the world in the first place, to create this place, the earth, in which he could send his Son, Jesus Christ, for our salvation. It's magnificent, the way Matthew starts his gospel. And you can see it when you pick up a little biblical Greek. The book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ. Now we see the purpose of God revealed. Okay, so I hope that's starting to tantalize your theological taste buds a little, that you're starting to see that already in this list there is some, a lot more than meets the eye. Let me show you some of the, why I say such great good news can be found in this list of names from Matthew. Now notice all the names come next, and it's basically Father, Son, this father begat that son, and the list goes all the way down to Jesus. It's almost always Father, Son, except when Matthew drags the name of some women into his list. Every time he does this, he's telling us something extremely important. He never has to refer to the mothers. He's going Father, Son. So every time a woman's name appears here, it's going to be of extreme importance. There are some real interesting people in this gospel. There are some real skeletons in the closet, actually, here. Now, every single name has a backstory, and I can't do all of them for you, but let me just look at some of the more interesting members of the family tree of Jesus Christ. We see Manasseh. Manasseh, the name of Manasseh. Manasseh was, he was one of the worst kings of the Old Testament. We see Manasseh's name in verse 10. Manasseh was really one of the worst kings of the Old Testament. In 2 Kings 21:16, we're told that Manasseh led the Jewish people into idolatry. Idolatry was one of the worst crimes a Jew could commit. The Jews knew who the true living God was. Manasseh was a horrible king who drags the people into idolatry. So Manasseh is, again, one of the skeletons in the closet here, to be sure. But notice, let's back up a little bit, and we'll see one of those women's names. We see Tamar in verse 3. Now, why does Matthew bring Tamar's name into this? Remember, he's doing Father, Son. You know who Tamar was? You might not, and you'd be excused for not knowing who Tamar was. You've never heard a sermon on Tamar. You've never heard the book of Genesis chapter 38 read out in church on Sunday. Tamar comes from Genesis 38, and you can read Genesis 38 for yourself, but once you read Genesis 38, you're going to wonder why that story's even in the Bible. Well, let me just give you the outline of the story. Tamar marries one of Judah's sons. Judah was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, Israel. So Tamar marries one of his sons, Judah, by name, and the husband dies. And so Tamar is due another husband. Judah was obligated to give Tamar one of his other sons to be her husband. Remember, back then, they don't have welfare, they don't have Social Security, they don't have Medicaid. If a woman didn't have a husband back then, she was forced into desperate straits, utter poverty. She would perhaps be forced into all kinds of things in order to just eke out a living. A woman depended upon her husband just for her survival, basically. So Tamar is due a husband. Judah sets her up with another boy. That doesn't work out. And so Tamar is left without a husband, and she's due one. Judah has lots of other sons. He's obligated by custom back then to give Tamar a husband to help her survive, but he doesn't. So Tamar, again, is forced into desperate circumstances here. Tamar, what does she do? She dresses up as a prostitute. She disguises herself. She's waiting out by an intersection somewhere. When Judah comes by, she ensnares Judah. He becomes pregnant. The whole tawdry thing is revealed. And by revealing the pregnancy, what Tamar's really doing is showing Judah, you have wronged me. You put me in this situation. You are the one who is guilty of the sin here. You are the one who's forced me to do such desperate things. And Judah recognizes it and then provides her with a husband that she was due all along. It's an outrageous tale, Genesis 38. Again, it's never read out on Sunday morning in church. That's the story of Tamar in a nutshell. Why does Matthew drag her name into this? I mean, he didn't have to. He's doing father, son, father, son. Why bring Tamar into it? Oh, you'll see here in just a little bit. Let me bring another few characters into this before I round this off. Notice who we have in verse 5. We have Rahab. Now, Rahab's a more familiar name to us than is Tamar. But, before we had Julia Roberts in the movie Pretty Woman, we had Rahab. Rahab was the prostitute with the heart of gold, that Hollywood cliche that's made a lot of people a lot of money in the movie business. But Rahab, who was Rahab? She was the prostitute who welcomes the spies that, they've left Exodus, they've left the Promised Land, they're entering the Promised Land, and Joshua sends the spies to look out and reconnoiter the city of Jericho, and he wants to check out Jericho, and Rahab lives in Jericho, and she welcomes the spies of Joshua into her home. She hides them, and she protects their lives. She's obviously a friend to the Jewish people, but she's a prostitute, and the Bible doesn't gloss over that. Why bring Rahab and her questionable way of earning a living into this whole story? You're going to see. She's one of the skeletons in the closet, but Matthew is bringing her in for a very important reason that I promise I will explain. Let's look at, in verse 6, we have a really fascinating entry. We have mention of the wife of Uriah. Now, the woman had a name. Matthew doesn't use it. Her name was Bathsheba. She was the woman that committed adultery with King David. But her name was Bathsheba. Why doesn't Matthew just call her by name? He could have called her Bathsheba. He is going out of his way to make a point by referring to her not as Bathsheba, but as the wife of Uriah. Matthew, by bringing Uriah's name into this, he is deliberately reminding us of the whole tawdry affair between David and Bathsheba. Uriah was the wronged husband. Uriah was the one who David had killed after Bathsheba becomes pregnant by him. Uriah was the man who was the victim of the worst things that can happen to a person. Why does Matthew go out of his way to remind us of this by referring to her not as Bathsheba, but as the wife of Uriah? I'm going to get there, I promise. Where is the good news in all of this? Well, let me give it to you right here. Matthew is going out of his way to highlight some of the skeletons in Jesus' closet and his family tree, and he does so, I think, for this reason. The people mentioned here have done some of the worst things that can be done, some of the worst things that the human race is capable of doing: murder, adultery, idolatry. Some of the worst things that people can do, these people have done. And this is the family that Jesus is entering? Absolutely. Jesus is joining us in the human race. He is entering the human race in order to save us from the worst that the human race is capable of doing. Look at the family, Matthew is saying, that Jesus is entering into. He is born into this family that is extremely dysfunctional. And the members of his family have done some of the worst things possible. Matthew knows that. Matthew is highlighting it. This is the condition that Jesus Christ enters in order to save us from it, to save us from these sins and all the other sins that the human race is capable of committing. Matthew is highlighting how much Jesus saves us and from what Jesus saves us by mentioning some of these real skeletons in the closet of his family tree. It's gospel, the good news of salvation contained in this seemingly long list of unpronounceable Jewish names. Okay, I'd like to move into more of Matthew's gospel, and what I want to do here is, again, focus on those things that are just in Matthew, things that only Matthew gives us that do not appear in the other gospel. Notice in Matthew 1:21 and in verse 25, it says that Joseph is the one who names Jesus. Not once, but twice, Matthew tells us that Joseph is the one who names the child Jesus. Why does Matthew mention this twice? Well, remember who Matthew was. Matthew was the Jewish tax collector who is called by Christ. He leaves that way of life and he becomes a follower of Christ. And as a Jewish man, he is especially concerned with writing in his gospel how Jesus is the fulfillment of all the Jewish hopes and prophecies and expectations. That Jesus is the one who fulfills all of the deepest longings and the prophecies and the hopes of the Jewish people. This is the main, one of the main points that Matthew wants to make in his gospel. Scholars think that Matthew was perhaps writing to a Jewish audience in particular, but this is the hallmark of Matthew's gospel, how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Jewish hopes and expectations. Now, the Jews long expected the Messiah to come from the house of David. This was the heart of the messianic prophecy, that the Messiah would come from the house of David. Now, you know, and I know, and Matthew knew, that the biological father of Jesus was not Joseph. That Jesus did not have a biological father. Joseph is of the house of David, but how can Jesus come from the house of David if Joseph is not his biological father? Well, Matthew presents Joseph naming Jesus. This was how Joseph claimed Jesus for the house of David. Back then they did not have legal adoption agencies. In order to adopt a child officially, legally, formally, the father had to name the child. By naming the child, the father claimed the boy as his own. So Joseph naming Jesus is Joseph claiming Jesus for the house of David, thereby fulfilling the ancient Jewish prophecies that the Messiah had to come from the house of David. Okay, we're going to see in Luke's gospel something different. In Luke's gospel, Mary is the one who names Jesus. If you look, just thumb over to Luke's gospel really quickly. If you look in Luke chapter 1:31, it is Mary, not Joseph, who names Jesus. Now, if Bart Ehrman were listening to this module, he might start to chime in. Okay, see, I told you, these discrepancies. This just proves all sorts of things about why the Bible's wrong, and he's off to the races. Now, my advice would be take a deep breath, Bart. First of all, these discrepancies are pretty minor. Joseph naming the baby, Mary naming the baby. And remember, both Joseph and Mary are told by heaven, by God, the name to give the child. It's an angel that brings the name Jesus to both Joseph in a dream and Mary, the Annunciation, as well. So the name comes from heaven. The name comes from God. These discrepancies, again, are admittedly minor. But I want to point out something that we need to keep in mind as we go throughout this course. There's the difference between the event, what really happened, and then the description of that event in Scripture. There's the event, something really happened, and then there is the account of it. Now, it's inspired. We believe that the account is inspired, of course, but the account is a description of the event. The event here is that Jesus is the Savior of the human race. His name was given to us by God. The differences can be accounted in the biblical accounts for theological reasons or even historical or cultural reasons, as we will see. But don't get tripped up on these differences. Again, the differences are there to highlight a different theological point, and they are always in service of the event that they are describing. I will continue to make that point throughout this module in the course and on the intensive weekend as well, if I need to. But we always have to keep in mind that the Scriptures are written in the form of a proclamation to inspire our faith. They're not journalists reporting like a newspaper would. They're not just giving us the events. They are giving us the events, but in a form of proclamation that is meant to inspire our faith and to deepen our faith. And each one will do so and highlight different elements of that to help deepen our faith. There's always the event and then the description of the event in Scripture. That's the point that I want to make here. Okay, let's go back to Matthew now. Matthew's Gospel. Back to Matthew. We have gifts in Matthew. chapter 2 of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. What's going on here? Well, gold is pretty obvious. Gold is given for a king. That doesn't take too much explanation. And frankincense, the Magi bring this gift. Frankincense was used especially in the book of Leviticus. It was the incense used in the temple during animal sacrifice, during times of worship. So gold for a king, frankincense for a priest. That's pretty straightforward, I think. But myrrh. Why did the Magi in chapter 2 bring myrrh? Well, remember what's going to happen at the end of Mark's gospel in Mark 15:23 when Jesus is on the cross? They give him wine mingled with myrrh. Why are they doing that? Well, when you ingest myrrh, it serves as a painkiller. Myrrh was anesthesia when it was ingested. The Magi bringing myrrh, this is going to be a foreshadowing of his death in a very graphic, very real way. Mary would not have rejoiced to have received the gift of myrrh. Myrrh was a painkiller. And notice in Mark's gospel at the end there, Jesus doesn't take it. He refuses the wine mingled with myrrh. Jesus doesn't want the pain to be dulled. Again, he wants to feel this. He wants to experience this for our salvation. Myrrh as a painkiller. I mean, it was a shocking thing to give as a gift. Giving myrrh back then would be like us going to a baptism and bringing along a morphine drip for a present. It was shocking and upsetting to Mary, I'm sure, to receive the gift of myrrh. But it foreshadows the death that Christ will suffer for each one of us. Notice in Matthew 2, verse 11, the Magi enter the house. Now, they don't enter the manger. The manger's in Luke's gospel. There's no manger in the gospel of Matthew. Instead, the Magi, when they arrive, they enter the house. What's going on here? Oh, it's wonderful, as you would expect me to say. In the New Testament times, people did not worship in churches. Churches had yet to be built. They did not have big, magnificent churches like we do today. Instead, they gathered on Sunday to celebrate the Eucharist in each other's homes. During the time of the New Testament, people met in each other's homes. There were such things as called house churches. And here are a list of just 4 house churches mentioned in the New Testament. But the point here is that when people came together for Eucharist, when they came together to worship their risen Lord, they met in each other's homes. They met for worship in houses. And so now maybe you see what Matthew is suggesting to his readers. When the Magi enter the house, his readers would have got it. They would have said, oh, now we see. The Magi are entering the church. Remember, the Magi were Gentiles. They were not Jewish. They were foreigners. When they come and they see the Christ child and Mary, they enter the house in order to find them. It's the same for us. The only place where we can find Jesus Christ is in church. It's inside the house. It's only in church that we experience Christ, that we can have a relationship with Christ. Now, some people may be thinking, oh, wait a minute. You know, I can have a me and Jesus and the Bible kind of relationship. Impossible. You cannot have Jesus without the church. You can't have the Bible without the church. It's the church that collects the Bible and that decides what's in the Bible and forms the canon of the New Testament. You can't even have the Bible without the church. Every single thing we know about Jesus Christ comes to us through the church, especially through the scriptures assembled by the church. But it is in the church alone, that we find Jesus, and also that we find Mary. This is a very Catholic, very authentically Christian scene that the Magi encounter. They encounter Christ and his mother is right with him. They find Jesus and Mary both inside the church. It's the only place where we will find both of them today. Matthew's gospel is the only gospel to give us the word for church, ecclesia. It's in Matthew 16:18 and 18:17. We'll develop that a little bit later, especially in the reading assignments. But I'm pointing out to you here what's unique to Matthew. And Matthew is the only gospel to give us the Greek word for church, ecclesia. from which we get the word church, the ecclesial body. At the end of Matthew 2, of the episode with the Magi, it says that they go home another way. Now, I think that's another key for Matthew's readers. When Matthew says they go home another way, I don't think Matthew cared really which highway they took home. Instead, the Magi go home changed. They go home different men. They go home with another life, basically, because of the faith they found inside the house when they encounter the child and Mary, his mother. They go home different men. That's what I think Matthew was saying when he says they went home a different way. Remember, one of the earliest descriptions of the church is the way, as we see in the Acts of the Apostles. Matthew is saying these men went home another way. They went home the Christian way. They went home as men of faith because of their encounter with the child and Mary inside the house. Okay, I mentioned one difference with Luke's account of the birth of Christ, where Mary names the child. Let me just say a few other things here. I know this module's primarily on Matthew, but I've already mentioned one difference with Luke. Let me point out a few other differences that occur in Luke concerning the birth of Christ. Notice it's in Luke's Gospel 2 verse 8, and we're going to see mention of the shepherds. The shepherds are only in Luke. The shepherds are not in Matthew. The shepherds are in Luke, and they are the ones to whom the angel host appears, giving them the great good news of Jesus' birth. For us to see the full impact of what announcing the birth of the Savior meant to shepherds, let me point out a couple of things, a couple of the burdens that the shepherds had to carry. I think to see the principal burden that was placed upon the shoulders of shepherds back then, look at Exodus 31 verse 15. Exodus 31 verse 15, that says, if you violate the Sabbath, you die. You are put to death if you violate the Sabbath. We know that the Jews were very dedicated to observing the Sabbath, and it's a sign of their religiosity to observe the Sabbath, in which no work can be done. We see Exodus 31:15 with a very forceful expression of that, and we know in the New Testament this is one of the reasons why the Pharisees went to put Jesus to death, because he heals on the Sabbath, he does work on the Sabbath. They think they are doing God's will by putting him to death because he does work on the Sabbath, and they've got Exodus 31:15 to back them up on this. So what's this have to do with the shepherds? Well, the shepherds are working out in their fields. They are tending sheep out in their pastures, and the sheep don't know when it's Saturday. The sheep have to be tended to. There is work that has to be done, Sabbath or not, Saturday or not. Somebody's got to do it, and the shepherds were the ones that had to. The shepherds violated the Sabbath every single time it came around. They could never observe the Sabbath. They could never take a day off from work. They had to tend to the sheep. So now can you see a little bit more about what devout Jews thought of shepherds back then? Devout Jews thought shepherds were atheists, godless, fringe characters, people who despised their religion. You could not be a devout Jew and be a shepherd at the same time because of the Sabbath regulations. So shepherds were always pushed to the margins. They were the outliers in polite society back then. It's not just because of the Sabbath, though. If you look at Mark chapter 7, verse 4, we have all those references to Jewish practices of washing cups and jugs and kettles and all of the Jewish ritual washings and the purity rituals in Judaism. Well, shepherds could not follow those either. There were no water faucets out in those pastures. The shepherds couldn't follow these regulations either. So shepherds were looked down upon by devout Jews. But notice these are the very first people to whom the good news of salvation is proclaimed, to people on the fringes, on the margins, to the outcasts, to those that are excluded. These were the very first ones to receive the good news of the salvation that comes to us in Christ Jesus. Now, The animals are not explicitly mentioned in Luke's gospel. We have the ox and the ass and the donkeys, and those are the typical animals that we put in our Christmas cribs today. It comes from St. Francis of Assisi, the tradition of the Christmas creche. St. Francis is the one who first assembled this and gave such a gift to the universal church. Where did St. Francis get it? Well, he looked at the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 1, verse 3, that says this: "The ox knows its master, the donkey its owner's manger, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand." The animals are mentioned in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 3. And St. Francis takes a little bit from Isaiah, takes the animals from Isaiah, he takes the Magi from Matthew, he takes the manger from Luke, and he puts it all together in the Christmas scene. I think that's a beautiful biblical Christian way of working with the Scripture. Remember, we are nourished by the fourfold gospel. We don't pick and choose. We need all of it. And St. Francis puts it all together for us in a way that, you know, some biblical scholars might say, well, no, he's mixed all this up and we need to keep them separate. And we do for purposes of studying the Gospels. And I'm giving you those distinctions too as well. But remember, we live by the fourfold gospel. We need it all. We don't just pick and choose. It's the entire biblical tradition that nourishes our faith. And we see that especially in the way St. Francis has worked with the Scriptures to give us the Christmas crib. Notice Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Just a word there. Bethlehem literally means house of bread. That's what Bethlehem means in Hebrew. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Now he's born there, of course, because this is where the Messiah was predicted and prophesied to be born. But Catholics see such another theological richness here. Jesus born in the house of bread. Jesus who was born to be our Eucharist. Jesus who was born to be our food. I mean, it's magnificent the way the plan of God just coalesces and comes together. Jesus, our Eucharist, born to be the bread of life for us, born in the house of bread. And, you know, it's not just with the name Bethlehem. 3 times Luke will tell us something related to this. He will say that Jesus is born and placed in the manger. Jesus is placed in the manger. 3 times Luke tells us this in Luke chapter 2, verse 7, verse 12, and verse 16. 3 times we're given this. So Luke's obviously going out of his way to make a strong point here. What is he saying? Well, the Greek word here is phatne. Jesus was born in the phatne, according to the Greek in Luke's text. Now, when we have manger in our minds, we think of, you know, the Germans giving us all those wooden mangers, and we have in our heads some of the Hallmark Christmas cards where Jesus is born in it and placed in this wooden manger with the hay coming out and all of that. Well, there's not a whole lot of wood in Palestine, and phatne is a technical term. It literally means in Greek feeding trough. Now we can see why they use the word manger in English. It's not incorrect, and manger just sounds better than Mary putting Jesus in the feeding trough. And if we would hear feeding trough 3 times in Luke's gospel, you know, it might be a little jarring. So I understand why they use the word manger, so do we. We all get that. But what Luke is saying, that the point becomes clear when we realize that phatne means feeding trough. 3 times, Luke tells us, Jesus was placed in the feeding trough. So again, the Eucharistic connections could not be richer or stronger. Jesus, the bread of life, born to be our food, 3 times, mention is made of him being placed in the phatne, the feeding trough for us. Isn't that great? What theology the light that it sheds on the biblical text. Okay, you know, when you look at the phatne, you see it's made out of stone. Again, not a whole lot of wood in Palestine. And this brings me to a different point. It's related. This is my take on things. This is, feel free to just ignore the next couple minutes here, but a phatne was made out of stone that was so prevalent in the Middle East. You know, twice in the New Testament, Jesus is referred to as a carpenter. Okay, and I'm not saying that's all wrong here, but the Greek word for carpenter is actually tektron in Greek. Jesus is twice called a tektron, which it can mean carpenter, but really it can mean any skilled craftsman. Any skilled craftsman could be a tektron. And since there wasn't a whole lot of wood in Palestine, I'm thinking, okay, maybe he was a carpenter. Maybe he and Joseph, tektrons, were really stonemasons. I mean, it seems more plausible to me that Jesus could have been a stonemason, a craftsman working in stone. There's not a whole lot of wood to work with in Palestine. It can be done, but stone was much more prevalent. We see that he was placed in a stone phatne after his birth. Perhaps Jesus was a stonemason. It's just my theory. Again, it's open to debate, of course, or even rejection. But in Mark 6:3 and Matthew 13:55, Jesus is referred to as a tektron, maybe a stonemason. This is just my opinion. But I have another reason for suggesting that maybe Jesus was a stonemason after all. The reason I say this is because of Psalm 118, verse 22. The stone rejected by the builders has become the cornerstone. This is the single most quoted verse from the Old Testament in the New. This verse, Psalm 118, verse 22, it appears more than any other reference from the Old Testament in the New Testament. The stone rejected by the builders has become the cornerstone. The rabbis really paid very little attention to this verse. They hardly ever, if ever, really commented on it. They just skipped over it. But it's the most quoted verse in the New Testament. Now, it's got the obvious reference to the death and resurrection of Jesus, the death of Christ. The stone rejected by the builders, the religious establishment, has become the cornerstone because of his resurrection from the dead. I mean, that's true. But think about this, though. The stone rejected by the builders. Do you know where Jesus was executed? On Golgotha, Calvary Hill. Do you know what it was? What Calvary was actually back then? Calvary was a stone quarry. Calvary was this stone outcropping where rock was quarried right outside the walls of Jerusalem. If you see on this map, in the old city, there was a stone quarry located right outside the walls of Jerusalem. Now this made perfect sense. I mean, if you go to Jerusalem today, it's a city of stone. There's very little but stone in the entire city of Jerusalem. Now it has stone walls around it, but the whole city, the floors, the walls, the buildings, everything is made out of stone. And you had to get that stone from somewhere. Well, the closer the quarry, the easier it would be to haul it into the city to build. Calvary was a stone quarry, an outcropping of these rocks right outside the city walls of Jerusalem, conveniently located to quarry stone. This was where Jesus was crucified. Lots of people were crucified here. Because it was a stone quarry, it was wide open, people could see, those being executed could be placed on display. I mean, the Romans picked their spots of public execution so that, everybody could see it and learn the lesson they were trying to teach. Don't challenge us, or this will happen to you as well. Jesus was executed in a stone quarry. And so the stone rejected by the builders, he's literally rejected in the stone quarry of Calvary. The tektron, the stone mason, literally rejected in the stone quarry of Calvary. It's my interpretation. This is my take on things. I happen to like it quite a bit, this interpretation, but I realize it's new, and it's again, just my opinion, but I offer it to you for your reflection, and I hope it enriches your theological thinking that perhaps Jesus was a stonemason who was literally rejected in Calvary, the stone quarry of Calvary, and then raised by God to become the cornerstone of our faith. Theology. I love it. Okay. That is the end of this excursus. I know I kind of got a little bit off track there, going into Luke and then into this mention of Jesus and the stone quarry and all of that. But let's get back to Matthew, and I want to just round this module out with some of the, again, key parables and key elements that only appear in Matthew. In Matthew 20, verses 1 to 16, the parable of the workers, only Matthew gives us this. And this is just a magnificent parable of the workers. And you know it. I mean, you can turn there and read through it, but you know this parable very well. It's about the owner who goes out and he hires people early in the day and then keeps going out and finding people standing around, keeps hiring people throughout the workday until the very end. At the very last minute, he hires those latecomers and he sends them into the fields, and then when they all come in at the end of the day to get paid, he starts with the last first and he pays them. And then the guys who started off early in the day think, well, then we must be getting more, and they get the same amount. And that's the heart of the parable. Now, to see how this parable really works, we need to know what a denarius was worth. The master gives the latecomers a denarius, and then he gives those who show up early and work all day the same rate, a denarius. Now, this parable is about generosity. It is about generosity. But it's not about monetary generosity. I mean, the master was a little more generous to the latecomers financially than the early arrivals, but it's really not about financial generosity. And you see this when you understand what a denarius was actually worth. A denarius was just minimum wage. It was the minimum wage for one day of work. So nobody's getting rich here. The master isn't giving that much money to anybody. He's giving minimum wage to everybody. Now, he's a little more relatively generous monetarily to the latecomers than he is to the people who started out early. But it's really not about monetary generosity. Because, again, everybody's just getting minimum wage that day. It's about generosity, but it's about generosity of a different order. Here's where we can see the generosity. The generosity is in the master calls everyone to work. He goes out and he invites everyone into his fields. He goes out and he invites everybody, gives everybody the opportunity to go work. You know, those slackers, well, that's really what they were. The latecomers were really slackers. If they really wanted to work for a living, they would have shown up early in the morning when everybody else did. That's when you were supposed to present yourself if you were going to be the hired hand for the day. And so the people who come late, they come late on purpose. They're slackers. They're latecomers because, well, they're just slackers and losers, and yet the master invites them as well. He offers them the opportunity to go into the field. Now can you see the generosity of God here? The generosity is not about money. It's about giving everybody the opportunity. It's about accepting even the latecomers, the late arrivals, even those guys are accepted and invited into the field. Maybe think about it like this. You and I, we go to church. We go faithfully. We go every Sunday. Is God going to be generous to people who don't? Is God going to be generous to the the Christmas and Easter Catholics? To the people who just show up every now and then? Is God going to be generous to the slackers? Do we want God to be that generous? I mean, here we are, we're busting it. We're following the rules. We're going to Mass every Sunday. Do we want God to be generous to those who just show up every now and then? To the slackers and to those who are not following the rules like we are? Do we want God to be that generous? Okay, now maybe you can see how the parable still works. If it rubs you the wrong way, even slightly, to think, wait a minute, God's going to put those people who just show up every now and then on the same level as me when it comes to eternal life, well, then the parable's doing its job. If we're just going to Mass because we have to, and then if we're going to Mass just because we have to and then judging other people who don't, the parable's got something to say to us. We don't go to Mass just because we have to. If that's it, then we're missing it. We get to go to Mass. And if we think otherwise, then, we're not there yet. And so it's not about, well, God's going to reward me because I'm following the rules and he's not going to other people because they're not. God is generous. God is generous to everyone. And so if we ever look down on people who aren't following the rules like we are, the parable is going to speak to us, or it should speak to us. Because, again, if we're just doing it so that, as insurance policy and then judging other people who aren't, then we're missing the generosity of God. The God of generosity who is generous to absolutely everyone. That's what this parable is speaking. And if it kind of gets you a little bit, then the parable's doing its thing. Okay, let's look at one more just magnificent Matthean element. Matthew 20:20. We have the mother of the sons of Zebedee. And notice she's not named here. We don't get her name. She's just called the mother of the sons of Zebedee. And we know the scene here. The mother of the sons of Zebedee comes up to Jesus and she asks him for a favor. And he goes, "What do you want?" And she says to him, "Jesus, when you come into your kingdom, have one of my sons sit at your right and one at my left." The mother of the sons of Zebedee, she is no dummy. She's a smart cookie. She sees that Jesus is going places. He's an up-and-coming rabbi, and she knows this, and she wants to hitch her family wagon to his rising star. She's saying to Jesus, "Hey, when you get yours, take care of my boys. When you come into yours, you make sure you take care of James and John here. When you get yours, you take care of them." She's trying to get these guys to have the prestige and the power that she thinks Jesus is going to end up with. She's trying to make sure her boys get ahead of the other apostles. And they pick up on this. They become indignant, and this whole scene ensues that Jesus has to straighten out. The mother of the sons of Zebedee. Again, I think we have here the quintessential Jewish mother. She'd probably even say, "Oh, my name's not important here. It's not about me. It's all about my boys." She's trying to take care of her two sons. And she does this in a way that I think is really rather delightful and almost comical here, if the consequences weren't so serious. The mother of the sons of Zebedee, she wants her boys to have power and prestige and position and all of that. Okay, notice Matthew is going to bring her back at the end of his gospel. Only Matthew does this. In Matthew 27, verse 56, only Matthew puts her at the foot of the cross. She comes back in Matthew's gospel, and only in Matthew, one more time after this, at the foot of the cross. And you have to wonder what was going through her mind at the foot of the cross. As she looked up and saw Jesus dying, what was going through her mind? Was she thinking, is this how it ends? Is this all there is? I thought he was going places. I thought he was going to take care of my boys. I thought he was going to give them a life of comfort and ease and power and prestige and all of that. What was going through her mind? Matthew doesn't tell us. And we never hear from her again after this. We don't hear from her in the Acts of the Apostles. We don't know what happens to her after she looks upon Jesus at the crucifixion. Did she come to faith? Did she finally realize all of that effort that she put into money and power and all of that, all the trappings of that? Did she finally realize what a waste that was? Did she ever come to faith? Did she finally let go of all that stuff and become a follower of Christ? We're never told. It's an open question. What happens to the mother of the sons of Zebedee after Good Friday? Does she come to faith? We don't know. But that's not the main question. The real important question is, how do we respond to all of this? Do we ever get trapped in those things? Do we, like the mother of the sons of Zebedee, put too much stock in all of that? The real question, I think, for us is not how did she respond, whatever happened to her. The real question is, how will we respond? Will we let all that stuff take a back seat and turn our minds and hearts and our faith upon Jesus Christ and live as he would have us? That's the question for us, I think, that really matters. Okay, thank you very much for your attention on this module. Of course, there's a reading assignment for you and threaded discussion questions await. Until the next time, goodbye and God bless.